Hey, good morning everyone, and welcome to the 2012 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present Mr. Frank Hadfield. Frank is the president of Palcoprep, a company based here in Drumheller that specializes in the collection, preparation, and assembly of specimens for museum displays. Frank is originally from Gimli, Manitoba, a little town situated on the southern shore of Lake Winnipeg. Frank gained experience in fossil preparation in the Manitoba Museum in Winnipeg and at the Canadian Fossil Discovery Centre in Morden, Manitoba. From 1995 until 2000, Frank worked as a field guide with Exposaur excursions, assisting in the excavation of a hadrosaur bone bed here in Alberta. In 2006, Frank founded Palcoprep, and over the years, the company grew and produced mounts for museums all over the world. Some of the projects Palcoprep has been involved in include dinosaur mounts for the Natural History Museum of Utah and the Hayashibara Museum of Japan, marine reptile skeletons for the Canadian Fossil Discovery Centre in Morden, Manitoba, and whale skeletons for the Beatty Biodiversity Museum at the University of British Columbia and for the Newfoundland Whale Tourism Initiative. Frank has a keen eye for details, a quality that makes him an adept fossil hunter. Frank loves to hike in the Badlands looking for fossils. Over the years, he has reported numerous fossil discoveries to the research staff of the Royal Tyrrell Museum, many of which proved to be significant specimens. Today, Frank will talk about a very interesting project in which he was involved. A few years ago, Palcoprep was asked to take a pile of disarticulated bones from a humpback whale that had been sitting behind a garage for years and assemble them into a complete skeleton. So Frank had to drive all the way to Newfoundland to retrieve the bones, bring them back to Drumheller to be prepared, and then return to Newfoundland with the whale skeleton in tow in order to assemble it at a local museum. In the process, landlocked Drumheller saw its first large marine animal since the bear posse retreated from the area over 70 million years ago. So without further delay, I present you Mr. Frank Hadfield.
Thank you, Francois, and also like to thank the Tyrrell Museum for inviting me here today to speak about a little bit about what we do at Palcoprep. I see there's a few people here from my generation, so I'm wondering how many of you got the reference to the Don Henley album from the 80s? Anyone remember that? Building the Perfect Beast? But whale skeleton articulation, when we started this company, it wasn't really our intention to begin with whales per se. We kind of wanted to ease into things a little bit. We thought we'd be doing more along the lines of reproductions and replication of prehistoric animals. But we had this sort of come upon us serendipitously, so we thought we'd take the challenge. I'm going to do a little, Cole's Note version here of whales and go through some of their general physiology, anatomy. What are whales? Well, we all know what whales are. I'm going to ask some pretty obvious questions here. They're a vertebrate, of course. They have a hard endoskeleton comprised of bones like us. Also a mammal. There's probably not very many people in the world now that don't know whales are indeed mammals. Air breathing, of course. They have lungs, not gills. And being mammals, they have milk. They suckle their young with milk. Even some species still retain a bit of hair. They're, of course, a marine mammal. In order to be a marine mammal, you have to live in the ocean for part or all of your life. Polar bears, sea otters, manatees, seals, these are all technically marine mammals. And lastly, it's a cetacean. Whales, dolphins, and porpoises are all cetaceans, the most specialized of all the marine mammals. Now, I'm not going to get into all of what's contained on this chart here today. What I want to focus on primarily is the two main groups of whales that are around today. Right here at this, where they diverge right here, the Odontoceti and the Mysticeti, and that's the toothed whales and the baleen whales. And the main difference between them, of course, is their feeding apparatus. And the two specimens I'm going to refer to today are from each group. And when you see them compare side by side like this, it's pretty obvious quite quickly, the huge differences in the feeding apparatus. Baleen is essentially tightly packed hairs that they use as a sieve to strain out the small copepods, krill, fish, things like that from the seawater. The teeth, of course, in this specimen here, this is a sperm whale. You can see the teeth in the maxilla have all been lost, and they only retain teeth in the lower jaw. This is the skeleton of a pilot whale, which still retains teeth in the maxilla. So two different feeding apparatus. Anatomical similarities, sperm whale flipper, human arm. Here we have the humerus. Just basically the same structure. There are some small differences here in sperm whale flipper, but just an elaboration of the same structure over and over again that we see in whales. Of course, these flippers that they have in the front are the only appendages that are left on these marine animals. And just thought I'd throw that in there for fun. One of our workers here is somewhat of a aspiring heavy metal guitar player, so he thought of the advantages he would have if he had a sperm whale flipper. So, oh. Skeletons, we'll get in and just talk a little bit briefly about what skeletons are. You can see how the great diversification here between this extinct pelagornid bird and the skeleton of this is somewhat of a dated picture. They call it a Greenland whale. That's now known as an eastern right whale now. Again, you know, the Coles note thing here. We'll do animals with skeleton, horse, swan, tuna, whale, snakes, frogs. The reason I put this in is that when we do tours of our shop, there's still a lot of misconceptions out there about what animals have skeletons. Some people still believe that snakes don't have a skeleton, even frogs. And we've even had some question whether whales themselves have skeletons. So it's kind of obvious here, but you know, not to everyone. Again, obvious question, the function of the skeletal system. We all have skeletons, but we never really asked what's the purpose of these things. So we'll go through this here quickly. Obviously, a support for soft tissue. Without a skeleton, we're essentially a worm. So protection as well. For example, the thoracic region here, protecting heart, lungs, things like that with our ribs. There would be even more concussions in the NHL if we didn't have a hard skull. So for that, leverage for muscles, attachment points for the muscles so that we can actually move, propel ourselves. Some of the less obvious things are for the storage of minerals that our body will draw on in lean times. The calcium, different phosphates in that can be used when we're not getting these in our diet. And of course, the production of blood cells, primarily red and white blood cells. And more specifically, what is bone? Well, of course, it's part of the skeletal system. It's one of the two connective tissues along with cartilage. Comprised of mineral salts, primarily calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. Very hard, strong tissue. Structure of bone, this is a very common bone that you find in the hills, very durable bone, but run-of-the-mill, not a lot going on here. This is the cannon bone or metatarsal of a cow. Pretty run-of-the-mill looking thing until we cut it open and have a look at some of the internal structure. And we'll just touch briefly here on how bone grows. You can see here this more dense area here, the diaphyses or midsection here is much, much thicker than at the end. And the growth in bone takes place at these two ends, proximal and distal end. This more spongy material here, and you can see this brief septum here that divides the two. At one time, these were two separate bones. They've since fused together into one. And another thing that this slide shows is that there's a common misconception out there that only birds have hollow bones. Not true. It's actually more common in most animals that, at least in the appendicular skeleton, that hollow bones are the norm. So we're through that. We'll get into some of the skeleton articulation here. I thought I'd put this Sparky picture in there. We often have Discovery Channel and media stop by, and they love sparks. So I thought I'd throw that picture in there and show how dramatic it is there. Logistical problems associated with skeleton articulation. Of course, you know, whales are big, so the size of the animal, that's one. You can't manipulate these things around as easily as you would a coyote or a cat or something like that, so we have to deal with that. Secondly, the cleaning of the bones. Unfortunately, when we get a lot of these specimens, the bones are in a bad state of repair. Accuracy of the articulation. This was probably the most frustrating part of the whole endeavor. Finding information on the osteology and the articulation points of whales, there's just not a lot of material out there to refer to. Installing the armature, and first of all is finding a specimen. We were lucky enough that we were approached by a group from Newfoundland to articulate a whale for them, so we didn't really have to search this out. Where this took us was to the furthest point, pretty much the furthest point in North America out here, in a little town called Kings Point, Newfoundland. And this drive here, we've made it a number of times, is 6,200 kilometers. So we got to see a lot of Canada, and primarily Eastern Canada. Great drive. I'd recommend anyone to do it at any time. It's great. So this is just a few vignettes of along the way. Of course, the prairies of Saskatchewan, the architecture of Quebec. This is in North Sydney, where you drive onto the ferry. It's about an 8-hour ferry ride. So this is how you pass the time on the ferry. Not a lot to do on the 8-hour ride over. So once we arrived on what's affectionately known as the Rock in Newfoundland, again, just spectacular place to go and recover whales. So one of the perks of the job is that you get to go to some of these fantastic shoreline places. Once we arrived, we had no information, no photographic information of what we were getting into here with this project. We were told that the bones had been curated quite well. When we arrived, we found that indeed this wasn't the fact. What we're looking at here is this high-tech security system that they had for the bones here. And having a background in anatomy, we quickly determined that these long elements here were indeed not bones. They were actually wood boards. So once we had determined that, we had a little closer look at what we were dealing with here. And here's some parts of the vertebra, parts of the skull, the scapula here. And you notice all of this black moldy material that's forming on the bone. We quickly learned all about that. Why that's forming on the bone is because there's oil actually left in the internal structure of the bone. And we had to deal with that primarily, well, throughout the whole project, actually. Very difficult to drive off. So, but they did have their sign in place, whale reconstruction project. So they had their signs up anyway. And it's funny how smells bring back memories. And this barrel brings back some terrible memories for myself. They took the smaller elements, the phalanges, things like that, and put them all in this barrel, metal barrel. And then they covered it with a tarp, which of course eventually leaked. It was stored outside for over 3 years. So what happens, the barrel fills up with water, the oil that's still in the bones putrefies, and so you've got this nice, concoction there. So we had to dump this barrel out. I can't describe what that smell was like. And of course I had flown out there to do this job, to crate this out, so I had just carry on, of course. So I didn't have a lot of clothes to change into, so the ride back in the airplane was quite interesting for everyone around me. I didn't have a lot of people focusing around my immediate area. So that brings us to cleaning the bones. This is actually part of the cranial vault from a sperm whale. And this is our whalebone soup. We'll talk a little bit later about this concoction that we have here. Cleaning methods that you can use. There's quite a number of cleaning methods out there. These all work, but it's always a battle of time. Time is money, so therefore we want to clean these things as efficiently and quickly as possible. If you have lots of time, burial in dirt, compost, manure works great, but it can take in excess of 20 years to break down the oils that are contained within the bone, so that's not really a practical solution. Chemicals, surfactants, different soaps and bleaches, nasty stuff to work with. Enzymes, the University of British Columbia tried to use enzymes to break down the oils that were in their blue whale specimen, and it failed miserably. So they resorted to vapor degreasing. Extremely nasty, volatile thing. Works very well, but what you do is pass an electrical current through a very aggressive solvent, and that causes it to vaporize. It goes into the internal structure of the bone and drives off the oils very efficiently, but it's very, very dangerous material to work with and uses a huge amount of power. Their power bill for 2 weeks of cleaning was in excess of $10,000. So then the machine they used was actually used to clean grease off of rocket engines. And boiling in water, again, great if you're cleaning a cat or a small bird or something like that. Not a practical solution when you're dealing with whales. Much, much too big. There would be an enormous cost to heat that volume, essentially a small swimming pool, for that amount of time to break down the oils and drop them off or drive them off. Soaking in hot water, again, not boiling, but hot water. We're starting to think that this is the way that we will go in future with future projects. And the solution that we think we've come up with is found in all the places, Iceland. And the secret to how they clean the whales in Iceland, when we spoke with them, they have a number of beautiful specimens that they mount there. Iceland is one of 2 or 3 nations in the world that still actively whale. So they know the anatomy of whales quite well. They know the articulation points, things like that, but they also know how to clean these things very well. And when I spoke with them, essentially what they do is heat the water to 80 degrees and just let the water act on it for about 3 to 5 months. And it's not an intrusive process, works very well. You're not using chemicals, anything like that. But I asked them to give me a ballpark quote on what it would cost to clean a large baleen whale. This is a blue whale, extremely large animal. You can see there's the lower jaws here, vertebral column, there's the maxilla there. And they estimated their cost at about under $4,000. And the secret to that is they're sitting on one big hot water tank. Lots of geothermal activity there. So water actually, hot water in Iceland to every household is free. It actually costs more to have cold water come out of your tap in Iceland than hot water. So it's a great place to be, great place to clean whales. And you know, you can always partake of a little dip yourself while you're there. It wouldn't hurt. So that's our plan for the future for our, some of the projects that we're going to be dealing with. Of course, the whale oil was the reason for, the primary reason for a lot of these animals being hunted to near extinction in the early 20th century. So here's, again, the cleaning process. We have, this is the skeleton of a sperm whale that we've laid out here on the floor to see how we were going to deal with all this black moldy material that was forming on the surface of the bone. We were lucky in that most of the oils had been driven off from this specimen before we started work on it. So it was basically just the surface material that we're dealing with. That wasn't the case with the University of British Columbia specimen. All of the oils were still contained within the specimen, so their job was much, much more demanding. So how we decided to deal with this was hydrogen peroxide. Why we chose this over bleaches, chlorine bleaches, is that you can arrest the action of the hydrogen peroxide on affecting the bone quite quickly. and it doesn't continue on after you soak the bones in water. Javex bleach, chlorine bleaches, things like that will always continue to break down the bone even after you've diluted it and dried the specimen down. So really recommend you don't use any bleaches like that if you want to preserve the bone. It's hydrogen peroxide is sort of a strange animal. We all have used the 3% solution for cuts and scrapes, things like that, you know, and for hair dyeing, you know, the old Dolly Parton and all that stuff. But we used the 35% technical grade, and we actually cut that back to 17% because it does effervesce a bit when it reacts with the oils in the bone. So we wanted to cut that back so that we weren't doing any damage to the internal structure of the bone. And doing the research for this talk, I found out at 90%, they actually use it for an oxygen source for rocket fuel. So it's a really strange thing. This is our before and after shot here, and you can see how good a job it does. Another thing too, for disposal, it's a great fertilizer. Once it's broken down to a low enough concentration, you can put it on your garden and works well. So yeah, it was very good for this purpose. I'm sure all of the technicians here and paleontologists here are familiar with this stuff, B72 acryloid. Essentially these plastic beads. After the bone has been dried right down, we consolidated the entire skeleton actually with a coating of B72. We still use B76 at our shop as well. Not really that much of a difference in it. We find it breaks down a little faster in the powder form than the B72, but essentially the same thing. How this works is that the acetone will dissolve these plastic beads, and it acts as a carrier to take the plastic into the internal structure of the bone. The acetone will then evaporate, and the plastic hardens again and consolidates the bone. The most common use for this industry-wise is your windshield of your vehicle. There's two panes of glass, and the glue that holds those two together, that's an acryloid. I don't know if it's exactly B72, but very common. Information. Again, as I mentioned before, very, very frustrating part of trying to get detailed information on the osteology of whales. This illustration here is from the late 19th century, and we referred to a lot of these drawings from then for a lot of our reconstruction. We referred to textbooks, of course, museum and university collections, personal communications with other people working in the field. Of course, the internet, we know everything's got to be true on the internet, so you know, we're kind of careful how we use that. And other mounted specimens. You'll notice the asterisk here. When I started this company, I wanted to kind of stay away from referring to work that other people had done in the past. And not just with whales, but with all animals where there wasn't a complete skeleton that was a good, and a lot of information on it. Because it kind of leads to the, well, my pappy said, and my grandpappy said, and you know, this is the way it is. And we also found that in some of the marine reptiles. I'm not sure if Takoya is in here today, but in working with him on the mosasaur, a common mistake that they had made with those, and again, looking at previous mounts, was the articulation of the tail. So we wanted to stay away from that and just glean our own information from our own sources where we knew where it was coming at and take a fresh approach to it. Here's after the entire skeleton had been cleaned in the hydrogen peroxide. I just want to point out quickly here, you notice here the brown staining that has taken place? Well, that's oxides from that barrel I was talking about before. When the barrel started to rust, these bones took on the oxides that were in the water, and that was the one thing that we just could not drive off. It was virtually impossible. We talked to the client about it, and they had us actually paint the bones so that they resembled the other ones better. But yeah, highly recommend, don't store your bones in metal containers. So we do this fit up to just, go over the skeleton, see if there's any pathologies there, see what we have, what we're missing, things like that. The flipper bones, intervertebral spacing, chevron placement, all these things we're going to discuss here briefly. This flipper from the proximal end of the humerus to the tip of this digit here is 19 feet long. So there's, it doesn't take a lot of error in the spacing of the phalanges and here in between these limb elements here to change the length of that. So you want to be as close as possible. So we had to deal with, and we're missing a number of these things here too. So we had to do the research on just how these things fit together. You'll notice the size discrepancy here immediately between this one and this bone here. Well, from all the research we did, this actually was the condition of it. Now, you would normally never see that in a land-dwelling animal, that drastic of a change in the size of the bone in the phalanges. But you have to remember that whales live in essentially a weightless environment. So the laws that pertain to a ground-dwelling animal don't necessarily pertain to them. So you never know really what you're going to get in these appendages in the different species of whales. This is a shot of the dorsal vertebra, intervertebral spacing. This was a bit easier as we had a number of these landmarks to go by. The zygapophyses here, we had the height of the neural spines, the width of the transverse processes. So this, it was fairly straightforward in fitting up the spine. Chevrons or hamal spines, sort of the lesser known bones here. That's these downward projecting bones here in the tail. There wasn't really a lot of facets that we could readily see here to indicate where the chevrons were, where they started and where they ended in the tail section. So we had that to contend with as well. You'll notice here the flexion of the tail. That's another thing that separates whales from fish. Their propulsion takes place by the vertical undulation of the tail, not a lateral undulation. So yeah, there's a lot of muscle activity going on there. Scapula positioning. How we went about determining where to place the scapula was humpback whales are well known for how they will breach out of the water and make these magnificent leaps out of the water. And when they do that, they'll rotate their flippers and violently slap them against the water. So we watched hours of video on these things breaching out of the water. And we looked for landmarks on the soft tissue like their eye and the back of the jaw, things that we could use to triangulate with the articulation here of the humerus with the scapula and give us a reasonably close position on where we thought the scapula would have to be. There was no other indication that we could find how to relate it to any other landmarks on there. So that's what we used to determine that. Rib articulation, another thing that was difficult. We actually referred to photographs on the internet. We trusted those of the Inuit people flensing whales. And from those, we were able to determine fairly accurately the articulation of the ribs with the transverse processes. These are actually the supporting armature that we used to mount the ribs here. Vestigial bones, leftover bones essentially. Of course, at one time, the ancestors of whales walked on land, so they had 4 limbs as opposed to 2 now. And there's evidence of this in some species of whales still retained. These bones here are what's left of the pelvic girdle, and we were quite happy to see that they had recovered those. You can imagine in a mound of 60 tons of rotting flesh, trying to find a bone, no bigger than a large chicken wing in all of that mess. So they did good to recover those, and that's a good thing to have for the story of the animal. This third bone here, however, And we were told by a number of people that worked on the flensing of the whale that this was recovered in very close proximity to the other two bones. Now, we contacted a number of researchers on this, and the only thing that we could come up with is that this was a baculum. And the baculum is an anchoring bone for the copulatory organ in, how do I put this, in male whales. So this has never been known in cetaceans. It hadn't been ruled out by any of the researchers that we talked to, so we mounted it in that position. Missing pieces. Unfortunately, we deal with this all the time. A lot of these smaller pieces and sometimes some of the large pieces go missing. I'm sure you all know Gilles Denis. He was an active participant in the reconstruction of this, and he was also made a good scale model. You'll see him in a number of these photographs here. Kept the place pretty clean too, so that was good. You can see the before and after shot of the flippers here, the reconstruction of these bones here. We use different materials to carve the bone. In this case, we used a carving foam. This example shows different foam. This is a 1.5 pound EPS, which is exactly the same foam that your stereo comes packed in, or your TV, whatever. And this is used a lot by CNC carving companies. It's a cheaper method, retains a pretty good register of the carving that you want. In those bones, for the flipper, we used a 3 pound carving foam. And then we cover that with a plastic shell. In this example, we used a polystyrene spray. And this is commonly known as Line-X, or truck box liner. Extremely durable stuff. And there's about a 24-hour window that you have to prime it, and then it holds paint very well. Good for outdoor display, things like that. Neural spine repair. For some of the cracks and missing pieces that we used in the axial skeleton, we used, in this case, Hydrocal, and in some cases we used what's called plasti paste. I think you guys are familiar with that here at the Tyrrell. Smooth-on product, very durable. We had a bit of an issue with plasti paste when they came out with their paintable plasti paste. It wasn't really all that paintable. So in this case, we used Hydrocal. Hydrocal is just plaster of Paris with a higher concentration of calcium carbonate in it. Very tough, retains good registration for when you carve it in the detail. And here's our artist just detailing the Hydrocal to match the color of the existing bone. And this is the finished product here. And to get that level of detail and have it match up like that, it takes a while to do it. We have a very good artist at our shop, and he's done a very good job with a lot of the cetaceans that we've done. Casting and molding, another large part of what we do at our shop. This shot here shows the dentaries of a sperm whale. And when we received this specimen, there was about 2 feet, a 2-foot section in the middle of the jaws that was missing when broken. So we not only had that to repair, but we only received about 30% of the teeth as well. So once we had completed repairing this midsection break right through here, he's not that menacing of an animal without his teeth. He looks like a sort of a giant anteater right now. So we thought we better get a full set of teeth back in this thing. So we worked on the reconstruction of that. This is what we refer to as free sculpting, where we'll just carve a tooth right from scratch to match other teeth as closely as possible. And once we've carved the teeth, we used these free sculpted ones as well as the existing teeth to replicate those and fill in the missing pieces. We made molds of these specimens. Gee, funny how things become glaringly obvious until you see them here, but these are actually sperm whale teeth. We used silicone rubber to make molds of the teeth, and after that we cast them in smooth cast 321 plastic. And this is the finished product here. And we found, even ourselves, we had a hard time picking out the copies from the originals with that. So a lot of these teeth we never even had to paint to match. With the smooth cast, they came out matching almost perfectly. So that worked out quite well. Support structures, again, more sparks here flying. Needs to be strong, of course. Lightweight, as almost all of these specimens are suspended from the ceiling, so we want to keep the weight down as much as possible. Conceal the work so that the focus is on the animal skeleton and not the armature that's supporting it. And you need to be innovative in your design because none of these specimens are exactly the same, especially dealing with different species. The main structure for the axial skeleton, this is sked 42-inch pipe that we bent to match the pose that the client wanted. And then we reinforced that with 1-inch flat bar, which offered more rigidity to the tubing, as well as prevented the bones from slipping after we had cemented them in place. This is a little bit of a confusing shot here. This is what you're looking at here is actually the ventral view or underside view of the palate, the back of the palate of a humpback whale. And there it is, the full skull here. So this was all broken off out here, the maxilla. And it was also cracked completely in half right through here. So we had to come up with a way of holding this in position while we glued the two pieces together, so then we could, after that, install the armature. So what we used was a shop crane to support the bottom half, overhead crane to then lower that down and take advantage of gravity to hold the two together. Again, this is just dealing with these large animals. You have to be quite innovative in how you're going to deal with these things. I'd like to test each apparatus before we take it for exhibit. This is, again, the sperm whale flipper. Again, total length of this was over 24 feet, 19 feet from there. So we wanted to test our apparatus to make sure that it was going to work. This finger alone was approaching 12 feet. So from here to here, you have quite a mechanical advantage going on there. So we wanted to make sure that without any support out here, this was actually going to support itself, which it did quite well, actually, and with a minimal amount of steel. These are just examples of some of the other armatures that we've used in other specimens. This articulating mount here was actually for the reconstruction of the UBC specimen. They didn't have exact measurements on how or where the skull was going to be mounted, so they needed to have some leeway in the skull. So we made it in such a way that the mounts could be, the skull could be articulated back and forth and match the ceiling. Hide and seek steel, again, whenever possible, we like to conceal it as much as possible. This was where the rib attachment for the humpback whale actually took place in the intervertebral spacing. Finger bones here. And this is the armature for the intervertebral mounts. And in here it's quite obvious, but once the armature is completed and installed and painted, if it's done well, they seem to just meld back into the background. We had to use these other support structures here to support. The client did not want us to make copies of the ribs, replicas, lightweight replicas, and mount those. So we had to mount the original, very heavy structures, these ribs, so we had to come up with a way of mounting them in place and have them not break off. Delivery, believe it or not, there's an entire sperm whale skeleton in there. And that's another reason why we make these things in a modular form, so that we can pack them up and transport them across the country. It'd be a lot easier if we lived in Denmark, but this is Canada, so just a reality. Installation, and the reason this shot here, this is the Humpback Whale Pavilion, and this was a bit of a disappointment. And I think this may happen, well, in all aspects of exhibit and display. Yeah, they don't build the pavilion to match the exhibit in a lot of cases. And I'm not sure whether they didn't know this or not, but whales are pointy at one end, fat in the middle, and pointy at the other. So the structure you don't want is an eye-shaped structure. So apparently they didn't take that into consideration, so we have all of this room at the ends and very little room, this constraint in the middle. Not really conducive to having people walk by, look at the skeleton, things like that. So don't, I think they should focus more on the exhibit and not the building. This is some of the structures as we brought them in. Again, you can see the armatures here, moving them in. This is how the whole breakdown of that flipper took place. And this is we actually, in the Humpback Whale Pavilion, it was designed so poorly, we couldn't even get back far enough to get a good picture of the entire structure. So I had no good photographs of this to show, so I thought I'd show the Sperm Whale Pavilion, which had more room in it. And this is the finished structure here, and they've done some nice designs here to reflect that. So once we had done that, on our return trip from Newfoundland, we had a bit of luck. This shot here, just for information-wise, I'm actually on a cliff about 800 feet high. And that gives you some idea of the waves that were rolling in just before we were going to get on the ferry to go back. So I thought I might take a little look around, because this may be my last chance to look around. So we were actually near a town called Cape Ray, which is just north of Port-aux-Basques, where you take the ferry back to the mainland. And the vehicle parked in the back, so we did a little searching and came across this structure here. From a distance, it just looked like a log washed up, but it seemed to have a peculiar shape to it. As soon as we got closer, we immediately recognized this was the lower jaw from a huge baleen whale. So undoubtedly what we think a blue whale. This is a blue whale specimen that's mounted in Monterey, California. And we had 18 feet of bone exposed, and it was still descending at each end into the ground for quite a ways. We saw no sign of the coronoid process on the proximal end of the dentary, and we measured it. I always have my rock hammer with me, and it's exactly a foot long, so we got a very accurate measurement here of 18 feet that was exposed with no coronoid process showing. So we think we may have a specimen that is in excess of the size of the one that's mounted at UBC. And how we know that is, here is doing our Iwo Jima pros here with the 12-foot dentary from the humpback whale. And we have actually the complete skull of a fin whale at our shop. So we've done detailed measurements of that. It's 15 feet long. The specimen that we worked on for UBC had 24-foot dentaries, and that's this specimen right here. So, and there's the coronoid process here that I was talking about. We think we had 18 feet right from here to about here. So we think we may have a specimen there that in Cape Ray that no one really is paying much attention to. That may be one of the largest blue whales in existence. So future whale projects, took me a while to get this out properly. Kikakarjuak, marine mammal hunt. We found out about this through actually my brother, who works in the Arctic and has been all over the Arctic, and he actually helped us in securing a polar bear skeleton from up there. And he suggested that we visit Kikakarjuak in the spring. There's a very active marine mammal hunt that goes on there. Kikakarjuak is located right there, not far off the coast of Greenland. Why we think they're hunting up there, and we'll get more of an explanation when we get up there, is I think this is a very active migratory route for a number of different species of marine mammals. So we have whales, narwhals, seals, polar bear, walrus that are all hunted here in about a 2-week period in Kikakarjuak. So if we're on site, we can do a lot of information gathering while we're obtaining the specimen as well, while it's being flensed. So articulation points, joint spacing, muscle attachment, all these things, we can get a lot of detailed information while we're on the site. But we have to be careful because we're not the only ones that are going to be interested in this carcass. We've been told on a number of occasions that it's not if, it's when these polar bears will show up. So we have to always keep that in mind. Pilot whale excavation, this is another project that we're going to be having in the future. Unfortunately, this scene here, this is a stranding that took place in New Zealand. These pilot whales are potheads or blackfish as they're known in eastern Canada as well. There was an episode like this that occurred in a little town called Little Burnt Bay, Newfoundland. I think it was 31 years ago now. We have exact dates on that, but how I found out about this is my son-in-law is from Little Burnt Bay, and he said he remembers, he was just a little boy, of course, at the time, he remembers when these whales stranded there, and there were over 40 whales that had died on the beach right here. And he remembers the Department of Fisheries personnel carrying some of the babies away. So we have this whole range of ages and sizes of pilot whales, and they're buried here in these mounds along the beach in this intertidal zone. And we made an application for a transfer permit and excavation permit for these whales and obtained that. So that's another project that we're going to be working on hopefully this summer. And this is the skeleton of a pilot whale right here, very closely related to orcas. The gray whale replication, this is a picture of a gray whale and calf. There's a specimen, I don't know if anyone has been down to Sausalito, California. There's a beautiful marine mammal center there, and they have a complete specimen of a gray whale calf. And this is the skull of the animal here, and it was so young that the bones of the skull had not been completely fused together yet and separated quite nicely. So this is an opportunity to mold these individual bones, which is something you don't get in adult specimens. This is the dentary lower jaw here. This whole skull, I'll just point out that this is a quarter on its head for scale, so a cute little specimen. And I'd like to just thank you all for coming out and learning a little bit about whale articulation. Thank you.